Shaka Zulu, a warrior king who founded a nation, but at a terrible price.
Nobody has ever accused Shaka of being cuddly. Nobody.
Cowards and failures had good cause to fear him.
They were thrown off a cliff and down into a river to be eaten by the crocodiles.
Shaka, the Zulu king whose mighty war machine beat the full power of the British Army in battle. In the early 19th century, Shaka Zulu claimed the throne of a tiny African tribe. He went on to forge one of the greatest empires Africa has ever known. Today, Zululand lies on the east coast of modern South Africa, a land of misty mountains, fertile valleys, and majestic rivers. In 1816, when Shaka Zulu came to power, his people ruled over just 100 square miles. But his ambition had no limits. Building the Zulu nation was an extraordinary achievement. In just over 12 years, his military force had conquered more than 20,000 square miles of land.
He fought against different tribes, so as soon as the tribe gets defeated, then he usually took all the belongings of the tribe, taking the wives, taking the livestock, and putting it under his control.
His vast armies had defeated 100 tribes, and 250,000 people submitted to his authority. It was a rule of fear. The Zulus' finest hour came against the British at the Battle of Isandlwana. Even after he had died, Shaka reached out to inspire the Zulu warriors.
This was Shaka's legacy. It was the people trained by Shaka using military applications invented by King Shaka, which really stopped the British Empire briefly in its tracks when it tried to roll into Zululand.
Shaka invented new military tactics and trained highly disciplined warriors, but he had a grip of iron and was utterly ruthless.
There are stories that he used to review his army at the end of a campaign, and the commanders would be asked to say, well, who didn't behave well, who hid behind their shield or hung back, and Shaka would have these people brought out and have them killed off in front of the whole army. You only have to have half a dozen people killed off to make the point to everybody else that actually it's better to get in there with a fighting chance than it is actually to face Shaka's wrath when you come home at the end of it.
The 19th century English trader, Henry Francis Fenn, who met Shaka, wrote in his diary,
"Shaka's lust for blood is unstoppable."
Shaka asserted his harsh authority just here, under the so-called Coward's Bush. Woe betide the warrior who lost his spear.
And for those who lost their spears on the battlefield, and will ask, "Where's your spear, my friend?" "I lost it, my king, on the battlefield." And then he'll just take his own spear and put it right on top of the foot of that young man, and he will start turning the spear very gently, and will just ask the warrior, "Do you see that you are weakening my power as a king? How come you lost your spear?" It was just a horrible lesson he could give to his warriors.
Shaka was a cunning strategist. He also knew the power of psychological warfare.
People literally would avoid his gaze rather than look into the spiritual abyss, into the darknesses of the universe, which stared back at them from King Shaka's eyes. Now, personally, I think that's something he was acutely aware of. It was very much part of his intimidating manner. He used it in the same way that he used physical violence.
Shaka's success owed much to his highly disciplined regiments of thousands of warriors. The Zulus called them impis. But his skills weren't confined to the battlefield. He was also a clever diplomat and far-sighted politician.
Around him, he managed to forge alliances with a number of chieftains with whom he did not fight, and he didn't massacre them. He didn't wipe anybody out. He forged very, very subtle alliances, taking them as they came and working different relationships opportunistically, as any good politician does.
At the height of his reign, Shaka ruled from his magnificent royal residence at Bulawayo, on the hills in the north of modern-day KwaZulu-Natal. Shaka's court was the center of all power. There were massive displays of dancing and singing. The performers called on the spirits of their ancestors for strength before battle.
The Zulus, certainly in the 19th century, believed that the most powerful ancestral spirits were focused through the person of the king, and this aura sort of followed him around.
The fate of the royal family affected every Zulu. This was doubly so with Shaka, whose close relationship with his mother, Nandi, dominated his life to the end. Her death had devastating consequences for all Zululand.
After his mother died, the whole nation mourned. Nobody could cultivate it on the land. Nobody could do what was used to be done while his mother was still alive. That was a sign for the rest of the nation to mourn for that short period of time.
The outpouring of grief led to atrocity and excess. The funeral was horrifying. The dead woman's handmaidens were buried alive with her. Elsewhere, the rapidly spreading violence shook Shaka's very kingdom.
There is a story that when Shaka's mother died, in an outpouring of grief, he actually had thousands of people killed across the country. Now, that might be exaggerated. There might be other things going on in the background there, and need to eliminate political enemies. But even if you scale it down, he was a pretty tough man. He was a man who was prepared to hold the nation in an iron grip as he forged this new kingdom.
But it was when that same strength turned into reckless brutality that Shaka started to lose his kingdom. The Zulus are an ancient people. According to legend, they came from a mystical land in Central Africa called Imbo.
The word Zulu actually means a high place, the heavens above. One usually translates the name of the people, the Amazulu, as the people of heavens. It means kind of up there.
By the late 18th century, the Zulu was still an obscure tribe, numbering about 1,500 people. They lived in a fertile valley south of the White Mfolozi River, below the border of modern Mozambique. There were many other scattered tribes in the region, all farmers and hunters, but they were all brave and dangerous warriors when they needed to be. Shaka Zulu himself was born in 1787, the illegitimate son of the Zulu chief. Nandi, his mother, was from a quite different tribe settled nearby.
My suspicion is that he may have been conceived out of wedlock, but that Nandi did marry kaSenzangakhona in the normal way later. But there was always maybe a little bit of a slur was possible on Shaka. And that came into later succession disputes.
He was the Zulu chief's eldest son, but the confusion about his birth meant that Shaka was not recognized as heir to the throne. Relations with his father were fraught. Relations between his parents were just as bad. Eventually, the friction between Shaka's father and his mother, Nandi, led to both mother and son going into exile.
Nandi was supposedly a very strong-willed woman. She went back to the Elangeni, her own people. And Shaka then, she took Shaka, her young son, with her. He grew up away from his father's people, really cut off from the male side of his family, from the people of his birth.
Much of Zulu history was passed down by word of mouth, and the details are hazy.
There's quite a lot of evidence that shows that Shaka actually did grow up in Zulu country under his father's wing and only fell out with him as a young man, not as a child.
In exile, Shaka and his mother were treated harshly by her own Elandgani people. They were outcasts. This way they were thrown even closer together, and this fierce bond with his mother contained the seeds of Shaka's own destruction. But the hardship he and his mother went through only strengthened Shaka's willpower and independence. He spent his early years as a herd boy looking after the precious cattle, but everyone soon saw that Shaka the warrior had special skills. He was so good at Zulu stick fighting that he was only challenged by boys who hadn't heard his reputation. No one who had heard about him dared to fight him. From these traditional stick fights, Shaka developed the aggression which marked his whole life.
He supposedly grew up lonely. He may have been embittered. It's difficult at this distance really to get a sense on how it affected him personally. But he then grew up ultimately amongst a people called the Mtetwa, and it was there that he became a young warrior.
Shaka was conscripted into the Mtetwa army. Their chief was called Dingaswayo, to whom the Zulu were then subservient. Dingaswayo had become chief through fierce warfare and clever diplomacy. He had built up a federation of more than 50 tribes.
Shaka actually spent maybe a decade under Dingaswayo, learning the trade of war, learning warriorship, distinguishing himself in battle, and probably learning a lot of political skills as well.
Dingaswayo deployed his warriors into well-defined regiments so he could better control his men in combat. This gave him a tactical advantage. Chief Dingaswayo became Shaka's teacher and mentor. Shaka was fascinated by military tactics, and he questioned traditional fighting methods.
There was a lot of fighting going on, but Shaka was the man who came up with a new system, a new technique, a way of using a different weapon, of using large bodies of men together to exploit the advantages of that weapon, which gave him very much a tactical edge.
He was keen to improve the effectiveness of the Zulu's chief weapon, the spear. He had rigorously practiced and played with spears as a youth.
Well, this is the sort of weapon technology that was popular before King Shaka's time. It's fairly simple. It's a throwing spear. It's made out of steel that was produced locally, fastened to a wooden handle. It's lightweight, it's accurate. You threw this at somebody at 20, maybe 30 yards range.
King Shaka stated that it's not good enough for us to use this spear that was used by my father because there is a lot of disadvantages in it. He said when you throw your spear to your enemy, sometimes you miss out and your enemy picks up the very same spear and throws it back to yourself. So he decided to introduce his own spear, the stepping spear.
He preferred this. It's a much heavier weapon. It's got a much bigger blade. It's got a shorter, stronger haft. This was a weapon that was designed not for throwing but for stabbing. And as you get close to him, you batter him with the shield like this, knock him aside, hopefully expose his body to an underarm thrust with this spear like that.
And King Shaka could listen to the sound that the blade could make if it goes into the man's tummy. And then he was so interested in that. It went if you pull it out. It might happen that the blade stuck into the ribs, or rather at the backbone of the man. As the blade stuck there, you just take your foot and you put it right on the chest of the warrior and you pull it out. So as it comes out, it makes the very same sound. And King Shaka named it Ikwa because of that sound.
I on the way in and Kwa on the way out. Ikwa.
Shaka is said to have spent hours sitting on his own and dreaming about future conquests, empires, and how he could win them. He didn't just dream. He distinguished himself as a formidable warrior and was renowned for his personal bravery in battle.
In his praises, he is referred to as somebody who likes to get stuck in when he's fighting, a spear that is rid to the very handle. He wasn't a person who held back and threw spears at other people. He liked to get in close. And there is right in that the very heart, the very essence, I think, of Shaka as an aggressive personality, as a ruthless personality, a person who believed in fighting, that means could be achieved through the use of violence.
Shaka argued for what is called MPE Bambu, total war that is red with blood. He thought that Dingaswayo's policy of leaving the defeated survivors to fight again another day was far too gentlemanly. He wanted complete victory.
There is a sense that he had a definite vision from the word go of how he could build a strong African people out of these disparate groups who were already in conflict with one another, how he could resolve those conflicts by bringing them all together. And the rival chiefs, the Amakosi as they're called in Zulu, either had to go along with Shaka or he would quite simply attack them and defeat them and make them go along with him.
Shaka's use of weapons and his military tactics was so successful that Chief Dingiswayo appointed Shaka as his commander-in-chief. But this was only an apprenticeship. The biggest challenge was about to come. In 1816, the Zulu chief, Shaka's father, died. Could the illegitimate son seize the throne? Southeast Africa in 1816 was a mountainous landscape inhabited by hundreds of marauding tribes. Shaka, the exiled son of the Zulu chief, had come back to claim the kingdom. He set out his stall by slaying a lion on a hunting expedition.
Shaka Zulu went with his brothers to the forest and he killed the lion by himself, and his brothers started to be very scared of him, including that brother was already appointed to be a chief of the Zulus. And then from there, he then said he is a king of the Zulus, and nobody could oppose him because they could see that he's strong enough, he's powerful, he might sometimes kill them.
Over the next 12 years, he transformed the Zulu tribe from a small clan into the most powerful empire in South Africa. It was a two-pronged strategy. Shaka Zulu entered into friendly alliances with neighboring tribes, but ruled his own people with absolute authority. In a whirlwind of public executions, Shaka is said to have ordered the clubbing to death of anyone who threatened him or might oppose him in the future.
Definitely there's a certain ruthlessness which is right at the heart of Shaka's personality, and it's very much part of his approach to battle and to controlling the people. Obviously, when you embark on a campaign of conquest, the first thing is that you have to defeat the enemy. It's very much a case of, if you don't fight, I will kill you.
Shaka's legendary ruthlessness has given him the image, not just of a fearsome leader, but of a bloodthirsty tyrant.
The myth of Shaka, the mythology of Shaka, seems to be as hard as iron. It just hangs in there. No matter what historical research is done or whatever challenges are made, the myth just powers on like this juggernaut.
Much of what we know about Shaka comes from two white adventurers, Nathaniel Isaacs and Henry Francis Fenn. They were not the most reliable characters.
Isaacs was 16 or 17 when he was wrecked here. He spent maybe 3 or 4 months with Shaka at most, and then went off and became a slave trader. He was a nasty piece of work. Finn was probably on the run from the law in the first place, having robbed the store at Bathurst. Those are the two major white sources, and both of them colluded to vilify Shaka. They made Shaka out to be a monster.
When Henry Francis Fenn visited Shaka, Shaka welcomed him, but Fenn repaid the hospitality with a gruesome account of life at court.
Shaka, with a flick of his hand, would order the execution of one of his entourage. Skulls would be smashed. He also had men seized and their eyes taken out of their sockets.
There are so many myths about him in so many different cultures. But there's no doubt in my mind he was a very ambitious, very ruthless, very innovative, and really quite far-seeing political leader. He was a man who had a vision for his own people and had the strength and the ruthlessness to impose that vision.
The picture of Shaka as a dangerous and unstable despot is not shared by many of today's Zulus. They see the man who brought them together.
He was a king of kings, I'll put it in that way. That means he was the greatest king. He had a brilliant idea of uniting the nations because we were scattered. Some were small, some were big, some were respected, some not. Now we wanted to have a new brand of a new nation.
But although we know about his achievements and his military courage, the hard facts about Shaka the man are quite limited.
We don't know when he was born, we don't know what he looked like, and we don't know when he died exactly. Now, the three major aspects of any person's biography are actually lost to us.
We only have one actual drawing of Shaka, which was done by one of the white men who visited him. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's been highly romanticized. So our physical understanding of Shaka, it's quite difficult to get a grip on him. But most accounts agree that he was fairly tall, he was fairly broad, he was a very powerful man. He dressed, of course, in the manner of the Zulus of the day, largely in animal skins. There's a good account of him wearing fringes of white cowtails tied to armbands and leg bands. He wore a collar made up of twisted tails from monkeys and catskins. He wore a similar sort of kilt around his waist. So, very spectacular physical appearance.
Shaka Zulu's impressive figure didn't at first deter his enemies. The greatest threat to his plans for the expansion of Zululand was Chief Zwide in the north. Chief Zwide, a powerful warlord, was as ambitious as Shaka, and Zwide held the upper hand. Shaka wasn't ready to face up to Zwide immediately, so he consolidated his defenses by moving to a new Zulu capital at Bulawayo. With a taste of things to come, he named it the Place of Killings.
This is Bulawayo, which was Shaka's first major settlement, or capital it's sometimes called, which he built here after he retreated south. And he established an umuzi, or settlement, around me here, down the slope, with his hut more or less where we are now. And the site was chosen, I think, primarily for defensive reasons. It gave a very good lookout over the Mhlathuze Valley, which would be the most likely place for raiders to come from. But it was also a very good resource base. It was within easy reach of water supplies. It was within easy reach of the safety haven of the Ngoya forest, should he need to retreat any further. And there would have been grazing for the cattle, both summer and winter, as they could move them up and down these slopes. The outer palisade seems to have been 200 to 300 yards in diameter, and that probably contained several hundred huts, maybe a couple of thousand people. It's very difficult to say. But inside the palisade would be very carefully ordered into family. The women would have been down towards the bottom, and the less important people, with the most important personages having huts close to the kings at the top of the slope.
Shaka knew that he would be outnumbered by Chief Zwide's raiders, the Ndwandwe. He was buying time so he could build up his own army. He drew together his warriors and prepared them for the inevitable battle ahead, and he used the time to make a new arsenal of weapons. Zulu blacksmiths forged thousands of the short stabbing spears that would be needed to repel the attackers. Shaka knew that an invasion for the Ndwandwe was only just around the corner. In 1818, Shaka, the Zulu leader, was facing his greatest challenge yet. His northern rival, Chief Zwide, king of the Ndwandwe, had been waiting for the moment to strike. Now he was ready to attack the heart of Shaka's territory, endangering Shaka himself. The Ndwandwe army had more than 12,000 warriors, outnumbering Shaka's forces by about 2 to 1. Shaka, entrenched at his Kwabulawayo stronghold, was going to need all his cunning against an awesome enemy. Shaka had prepared a battle plan, using a formidable military maneuver known as the Horns of the Bull. The move wasn't his invention, but he had refined it perfectly for his battle.
Basically, you had 3 tactical bodies, side by side, 1, 2, 3. In the centre you had a body which was called the chest, which advanced straight at the enemy, and then on either side you had flanking parties, encircling parties, which they called the horns.
Shaka's aim wasn't just to surround his enemy on all sides, but to do it secretly. That way his men could get in close with their lethal stabbing spears and finish the enemy off.
King Shaka instructing the horns on the sides to lie down so that they hide away from the eyes of the enemies. And then as soon as the enemies get closer enough, and then he will start shouting. He will say, Sebe Pagat, which means they are now close enough, just to inform the horns to rise up. The horns used to be the young warriors who could run very fast, and they could start encircling the enemies. And the enemies find themselves being in the center of the circle, and they start stepping them using their stepping spears.
The Horns of the Bull maneuver was just one of the ruses Shaka used to outwit the Ndwandwe.
What he did was retire before the Ndwandwe advance. He left cattle and things to lure off some of their army to reduce their numbers. He mounted attacks at night. Small parties would sneak into their camp and just stab men in the darkness to cause panic and fear. Eventually the Ndwandwe then start to retreat, and Shaka pursued them, and as they were crossing a river, Shaka then struck them, and he broke up this major concentration of Ndwandwe troops, actually scattered them, pretty much destroyed the Ndwandwe as a viable threat, and in the process very much made himself the ruler of Greater Zululand.
Shaka had crushed his enemy. Now he made sure they would never march against him again.
After he defeated their army in battle, he sent his regiments into their country to destroy their huts, and he said to them, even smash their hearthstones, so that there will be no way that these people can live here again if they don't submit to Shaka. This is what happens if you go up against me.
With the Ndwandwe opposition destroyed, Shaka carried on with his plans for the expansion of Zululand. By 1821, Shaka Zulu's empire had grown to over 9,000 square miles of Southeast Africa. His military campaigns guaranteed prosperity for the people and rich rewards for his faithful troops.
There was certainly a sense in which the Zulu people became wealthy under King Shaka. There was a competition at the time for natural resources. It's one of the elements which led to conflict in the region. And there's no doubt commanding a much wider area of territory gave the Zulus access to good grazing ground and water for their herds throughout the year. But also the Zulu were growing rich in cattle. One reads about Shaka's impis returning from campaigns, bringing thousands of cattle with them.
But while his men feasted, Shaka's busy mind was devising yet more new military tactics and ways to improve his fearsome fighting force. He recognized that speed and the ability to run fast in battle were crucial to success. He made all warriors fight barefoot, on pain of death.
He arranged for a certain thorn from an African acacia bush to be strewn over a parade ground, and he said to the men, right, get your shoes off now, you can come in here and you can dance these thorns flat. I want to see them crushed into the dust. And 1 or 2 men objected to this, and immediately Shaka had them knocked on the head with clubbed sticks and killed. And of course everybody else then decides, oh no, okay, we better get on with it.
When armies turned and fled in their clumsy sandals, they had no chance against the barefooted Zulus.
Right from the beginning, you have this sense of drive and ruthlessness that Shaka has this vision of how men should work in combat, how tough they should be, what's needed, what's required of them to make them efficient, and he's prepared to kill people to make sure that it happened.
But as the victories grew, so did the cruelty. Children, women, the old, none were spared. Henry Francis Fenn tells a bloody tale about Shaka's callous murder of his own infant son.
Shaka objected to being called a father by one of his mistresses. He seized the little innocent and threw it into the air. It was killed by the fall. The mother was instantly put to death.
His family were just the immediate victims of a wrath which spared no one, least of all his army. The coward's bush punishment killings of those warriors deemed to have held back in battle added to his bloodthirsty reputation.
Sitting under this bush, Shaka would then say, "This is the thing then that you fear so much." And he would have his men hold up their arms, apparently, and then they would stick the spear into them and finish them off. And he'd say, "There we are. It's better actually to go and face it in open battle, because otherwise you're going to have to face it with me when you come back anyway." And the bush that he sat under is still growing in Zululand to this day.
The extent of the coward's bush killing may be disputed, but the stories only help build the legend.
He needed to punish cowardice in some form. He needed to get men to follow him. The circumstances were dire. The nation was under considerable threat. So he had to promote military valor by whatever means he needed to. But it's unlikely that he killed off large numbers of his own soldiers, who he would need very badly in battle anyway.
Shaka recognized the importance of psychology. He used both fear and humiliation to discipline wayward warriors.
He would get his cows to eat meat soaked in milk, which was the kind of food fed to babies. So in other words, he was implying that they were childish or immature, and that would shame them in front of their peers and hopefully promote greater valor in the next encounter.
At the Zulu capital, Bulawayo, music and dance played an important role in all aspects of Zulu life. Dancing was a part of the ritual build-up to battle, and ritual provides a constant reminder of a king's power and authority. But even at court, a Zulu subject had to be wary.
His court was famous for the fact that he was very strict with everybody in attendance. If you coughed in the middle of his speech, you were likely to get taken off and knocked on the head. If you made him laugh, if you cracked a joke when he was trying to be serious and spoilt the mood, you were likely to be knocked on the head.
Henry Francis Fenn wrote in his diaries,
He liked to impress by unpredictable executions. One famous place for murder was a high cliff named Execution Rock.
Execution Rock became a place to be regarded with absolute fear. It was the definitive symbol of Shaka's rule of terror.
There's an element of definitely intimidating everybody by using the death penalty so frequently. But half a dozen people might in a given day be taken off to the place of execution. They were thrown off a cliff and down into a river to be eaten by the crocodiles. So it was a fairly nerve-wracking place to actually go and attend to King Shaka himself.
But while Shaka asserted his grim authority in Zululand, elsewhere in Africa other forces were stirring. Change was afoot, and it wouldn't leave Shaka untouched. After 8 years of autocratic rule, the cracks started to appear in Shaka Zulu kingdom. The first warning sign was the arrival in Port Natal of a party of British adventurers, including Henry Francis Fenn. They had heard about Shaka's wealth and had come to trade for ivory, minerals, and exotic goods, But their long-term aim was to build a colonial settlement, and their arrival was viewed with apprehension.
In 1824, the first whites arrive in the area and are very much the harbingers of doom and destruction as far as the Zulus are concerned. Shaka was attracted to these whites. He was interested in them. They had guns, which fascinated him. But at the same time, he recognized straight away there was a conflict inherent in their arrival in the area, and that ultimately one day the Zulus would pay the price for that.
While the three English adventurers were staying at Shaka's royal homestead, there was an attempt on Shaka's life by an assassin from a rival tribe. Henry Francis Fenn helped to treat Shaka's wounds.
I washed the wound with chamomile tea and bound it with linen. He had been stabbed with an assegai spear in the left arm and stomach.
Shaka believed that the Europeans' medicine had saved his life and wanted to express his thanks. The British adventurers seized the moment for their own gain. They persuaded Shaka to grant them land to establish a permanent settlement. This included Port Natal, modern Durban, and the land formed the foundations of the first British colony in the area. It was a dangerous foot in the door. The next threat showed that even the most powerful ruler, like Shaka, can fall victim to his own innermost fears. He had no worries yet about external forces, but did have a fear of dark internal forces, the power of witchcraft.
Shaka's life is full of stories about dreams and witchcraft and witches hunting down certain people, of Shaka politically trying to resist the influence of those inyangas or medicine men who had considerable force in the community.
The Zulu people believed that powerful ancestral spirits worked through their chief, Shaka.
He was also very much the spiritual head of the nation. He was the embodiment of the ancestral spirits, all of the powerful spirits that the Zulu people believed in. And as such his person, therefore, was regarded with a sense of reverence, with a sense of great potency and power. Anything that Shaka had touched or had intimate contact with could be used by his enemies.
The man who ruled by fear was himself afraid. In his own mind, witchcraft was his weak link, the method by which he could be brought down.
If an enemy managed to get into the household and gain something personal as intimate as the shavings from Shaka's face, they could be used to great effect against the Zulu people through magical means.
Every aspect of Shaka's life was watched in case it made him vulnerable. This involved looking out for the workings of evil spirits.
All of his food was very carefully prepared to keep it free from poison, but also to make sure that nobody had cast any sort of evil influences over it, which would affect not only his person, but the nation as a whole.
But despite the impending threat from the British expansion, and despite these primeval fears, Shaka's empire was stable and far-reaching. In 1827, it was pretty much at its most powerful. That year, Shaka moved his capital to Kwadukuza, the modern town of Stanger. He held 20,000 square miles of central Zululand between the Black Mfolozi River in the north and the Thukela River in the south, all firmly under his control. But at the very height of his power, a personal tragedy turned into the greatest threat yet. In spring 1827, Shaka was out hunting when news arrived that his beloved mother, Nandi, had died. Nandi's death was a shocking blow by itself. It may have been more devastating still if, as many believe, Shaka himself killed her. His secret fears would have supplied the motive.
He's supposed to have been very wary of raising up an heir who obviously would challenge in later life his accession. And there are rumours, not really more than that, that he actually fathered a number of children at different times in his life, and that he actually then had them killed off quietly behind the scenes before they grew to adulthood, before they could ever actually challenge him.
One story suggests that Nandi, his mother, secretly hid one of Shaka's children. And when Shaka found out, he went into a rage and violently attacked her.
There's some versions that say that Shaka killed Nandi, but I'm sure that these are stories that were propagated afterwards. It's almost virtually certain from the contemporary sources that she died of natural causes, dysentery or something related to that. And she was buried here in the middle of what would have been her kraal, her umuzi, which was not far from Kabulawayo and was a seat of some power for her. She was a powerful woman under Shaka.
What everybody is agreed on is that Shaka was overcome with grief. He gave Nandi a traditional royal burial. Henry Francis Fenn wrote in his diary,
At the burial, Nandi was placed in a sitting position, and 10 of her handmaidens had their arms and legs broken and were buried alive with her, in order to look after her and serve her in the new world.
The death of Nandi had a traumatic effect on Shaka. He was driven mad by grief and embarked on a new wave of atrocities. In just 12 years, Shaka had forged the greatest nation in Africa. But there was a heavy cost in blood and cruelty. Shaka's reign of terror began to collapse during the outpouring of grief over the death of his mother, Nandi.
On Nandi's death, Shaka was said to have been, by some, to have been precipitated into grief, such that there was an enormous orgy of killing. People who were not mourning properly, were not found with tears in their eyes, were killed off. And Finn alleged that some 7,000 people were killed. Now, none of the other accounts support that.
Shaka may have used the death of his mother as an excuse to purge internal opposition.
It's almost certain that there were some opportunistic killings, but as soon as Shaka heard about them, he stopped them. Probably very, very few people were actually killed.
The traditional Zulu belief system required 3 months of intense mourning. No crops were to be grown, no milk to be drunk. This was a period of self-sacrifice.
It seemed to have been traditional that in order to expunge the grief of the loss, that a raid would have to be conducted on a neighboring people and a certain amount of cattle taken and brought back and given in tribute, as it were, to the memory of the lost one.
There are legendary stories of the harsh measures imposed by Shaka Zulu, leading to barren fields and starvation. Thousands were massacred around that time. Even amid the slaughter, Shaka could respect those who honestly stood up to him.
When King Shaka's mother died, nobody is allowed to milk the cows, nobody is allowed to plow the fields, and they all need to cry because they need to mourn for his mother. Then people died because they didn't have food, but except one man who went straight to him and just told him that if people die, who are going to rule? Then, because Shaka wanted somebody who can speak truth, then he saw that this person, he can just go straight to him and tell the truth, and Shaka give him a present of cows. He wanted somebody who's confident in whatever he believes in. That means if you come to Shaka, if you don't believe what he's saying, you can tell him your point of view.
But Shaka's growing violence was endangering his very kingdom. His enemies began conspiring against him.
It may well be that Shaka himself was losing his grip on power within the nation. Certainly there was an increase in killings in the last years of his reign. And there was a sense that even his own family felt, no, we've had enough of this now. He's pulled the country together, he has made this great kingdom, but where does it go from here?
Eventually, Shaka fell victim to a palace coup. In the modern town of Stanger in South Africa, there's a statue in memory of Shaka, the warrior king. It was here in 1828 that Shaka's enemies, who included his own family, found the courage to strike.
A plot coming from within the royal family was legitimised because it had that weight of tradition. It was his own brothers that killed him. And indeed, after his death, the first thing his brothers did was to turn around and issue a sort of public appeal to the Zulu people and saying, look, this man now was a tyrant, we had to finish him off.
The chief conspirators were his two half-brothers, Dingane and Milangana. They had a lot to gain and could get close to him.
Dingane was probably at loggerheads with Shaka for all their lives. And although he disappears from the record during Shaka's reign, he was clearly still around, and he was probably behind maybe 3 assassination attempts on Shaka.
Their chance came in 1828 at Shaka's house. There was a failure in the protection which normally surrounded Shaka. He was left alone. Dingane and Milangana brutally stabbed the Zulu chief to death with the very stabbing spears Shaka had invented.
Shaka had become a madman. Well, probably not quite a madman, but certainly he'd possibly outlived his usefulness as far as the process of nation building was concerned.
Dingane succeeded Shaka. He might have said he had acted to stop the killings, but he soon set off on a murder spree of his own, purging any possible opposition from Shaka's followers.
Dingane felt a need to amplify the atrocities of Shaka precisely because it was an illegitimate killing, and therefore in order to draw people onto his side, he needed to build up his propaganda machine. And he continued killing off Shakan followers for many years afterwards.
King Shaka's dying prophecy was that the Zulu kingdom would be defeated by the European settlers.
At the moment that his assassins pounced upon him, he turned round to them apparently and said, well, sons of my fathers, you won't gain anything by this. When I am gone, the land will see white people come. You will not rule when I am dead.
Shaka's dying words came back with a vengeance to haunt his people. Within a decade, British and Dutch settlers were moving in, colonizing Zululand. With European colonialists spreading through southern Africa, conflict was inevitable. But the Zulus had some resistance left, and they owed that to the legacy of Shaka's military genius. Even though Shaka had been dead for 50 years, he still gave the Zulus their finest hour.
The Battle of Isandlwana in January 1879 was an extraordinary occasion in military terms. On one side you have the most sophisticated, powerful military technology of the age, the British Empire, with breech-loading guns and artillery and rockets. On the other side you have an African people who are still primarily, yes they had firearms, but primarily they're armed with shields and spears as they were in King Shaka's time.
In this historic battle, Shaka's battle tactics inflicted a terrible defeat on the armies of the British Empire. For the Zulus, it was a spectacular victory. The British column was virtually wiped out. From an army of 1,700 troops, only 400 survived.
The whole Shakan thing, the use of scouts, the use of ground, the use of moving rapidly, really, during the Isandlwana campaign in early 1879, the British are completely outclassed and outgeneraled.
Even Shaka's legacy couldn't last. Superior British technology and firepower triumphed after 6 months of further battles. Today, the image of Shaka Zulu is either heroic warrior king or ruthless bloodthirsty tyrant. What is undeniable is Shaka Zulu forged one of the mightiest empires Africa has ever known. In 1816, when Shaka Zulu came to power, his people ruled over just 100 square miles. But his ambition had no limits. Building the Zulu nation was an extraordinary achievement. In just over 12 years, his military force had conquered more than 20,000 square miles of land.
He fought against different tribes, so as soon as the tribe gets defeated, then he usually took all the belongings of the tribe, taking the wives, taking the livestock, and putting it under his control.
His vast armies had defeated 100 tribes, and 250,000 people submitted to his authority. It was a rule of fear. The Zulus' finest hour came against the British at the Battle of Isandlwana. Even after he had died, Shaka reached out to inspire the Zulu warriors.
This was Shaka's legacy. It was the people trained by Shaka using military applications invented by King Shaka, which really stopped the British Empire briefly in its tracks. I think personally Shaka is a very dynamic, charismatic, ambitious, far-seeing individual, somebody who found himself in a culture which was in conflict at the time and saw very much where that could go, and recognised, like a lot of fairly powerful figures throughout history, that the way to achieve something was to be ruthless about it. So there is definitely a dark side to him. He was undoubtedly a violent man, but at the same time he was arguably a visionary. He was a man who saw where his people could go, and he was prepared to use fairly ruthless and fairly dynamic means to achieve that. And his legacy is one that shaped a good deal of modern South Africa in lots of ways, certainly into the 19th century. It influenced the course of Southern African history very significantly, and that's rolled right into modern times. And indeed, a lot of people have a view of Shaka which means different things to them today in Southern Africa. He is a very iconic and powerful figure still today.
Nobody has ever accused Shaka of being cuddly. Nobody. I think he was one of a number of leaders in this region who were responding to an upsurge in violence over a period of maybe 50 or 70 years. He was probably almost certainly the most competent and successful of those leaders. The source of the violence is somewhat controversial. My take on it is to involve slaving from southern Mozambique as one of the triggers that probably set it all off, but over quite a long term and in incremental stages. But Shaka was a man who found himself caught in this situation, found himself in charge of the nascent Zulu people, who were still quite a small group, and did his best to defend those people and bring others to join him against a common situation, against a common enemy. So in many ways he was a defensive leader rather than an offensive leader. And he was a real human being, a real flesh and blood, mind and body, dealing with very real political situations and very real environmental constraints. He wasn't superhuman. He wasn't superhuman either in the direction of pathological violence, and he wasn't superhuman in the direction of unbeaten military genius. He was, surprise, surprise, somewhere in between. And that is the basis of my portrait of him, is to try to interpret him as a real person responding to real situations and doing the best he could under very, very difficult circumstances.
Well, because before, like I was saying, that we never had something like the Zulu nation. It originated by him. He tried his level best to unite the nation through the wars, defeating different tribes to form one big Zulu nation. And then he's still very, very famous and popular to the Zulu nation even nowadays, because we never had Zulu kingdom. So through him, we ended up having Zulu kingdom. Even in nowadays, we're still having our living king. What I was told is King Shaka was a bit despotic, to such an extent if somebody has been doing something wrong and then there were people responsible for putting those people to death. We call that a ukusakwa koqanyao. I would say he was doing best, because sometimes there are possibilities whereby the person should be despotic. like to get people back on track, to discipline people. Because if you are soft all the times, things will be scattered, So you have to be sometimes be despotic, be autocratic, that I want this to be done. It's the way of disciplining your people.